Have you ever noticed that two people can walk through the exact same storm, pray the same prayers, and read the same Bible, yet come out with completely different lives? One grows stronger, calmer, and more hopeful. The other becomes discouraged, anxious, and convinced that God has forgotten them. If the circumstances were nearly identical, then the difference couldn't have been the situation itself. It had to be something happening long before anyone else could see it. Most people assume the greatest miracles happen around us. A financial breakthrough, a healed relationship, a new opportunity, a door that suddenly opens after months of waiting. Those moments are powerful, and throughout Scripture we see God working in remarkable ways. But what if the greatest transformation God desires often begins somewhere much quieter? What if the first battlefield isn't your career, your family, or your health, but the thoughts you allow to shape your life every single day? Think about a pilot flying through thick clouds. From inside the cockpit, visibility disappears. Every instinct tells the pilot to trust what feels right. Yet experienced pilots know that feelings can become dangerous when the horizon disappears. Instead, they trust the instruments. Those instruments reveal reality even when their senses cannot. Our minds work in a surprisingly similar way. During seasons of uncertainty, fear can feel like truth. Doubt can sound logical. Worry can seem responsible. But feelings are not always reliable guides. That's why so many people stay trapped in cycles they desperately want to escape. They don't necessarily lack faith. They don't lack intelligence or determination. Often, they simply keep returning to the same patterns of thinking, and those thoughts quietly shape every decision that follows. Imagine waking up tomorrow with two voices competing for your attention. One immediately reminds you of every mistake you've made, every opportunity you've missed, and every reason your future probably won't improve. The other quietly reminds you that growth is still possible, that your identity isn't defined by your failures, and that today's choices matter more than yesterday's regrets. Which voice would shape the rest of your day? Most of us would say we'd choose the second one, yet many people unknowingly spend hours feeding the first. This isn't a modern problem created by smartphones or social media. Human beings have wrestled with destructive thinking for thousands of years. Long before endless notifications and 24-hour news cycles, people struggled with fear, comparison, pride, discouragement, and uncertainty. Technology changed the speed of those thoughts, but not their nature. One of the most fascinating patterns throughout Scripture is that God repeatedly addresses people's thinking before He changes their circumstances. Again and again, we see ordinary men and women standing at moments that seem impossible. The obstacle looks overwhelming, the future uncertain, and the outcome unclear. Yet before God removes the obstacle, He begins reshaping the person facing it. That order matters more than most people realize. It's natural to believe lasting change comes from changing what's happening around us. If only we had a better job, a healthier body, more money in the bank, a more supportive family, then we'd finally experience peace. But life has an interesting way of challenging that assumption. Have you ever met someone who appeared to have everything and still lived with constant anxiety? Maybe they had financial security, a successful career, and opportunities many people dream about, yet they never seemed satisfied. Then you've probably also met someone whose life looked incredibly difficult from the outside, yet they carried a deep sense of peace that couldn't be explained by their circumstances. How is that possible? Because peace isn't always created by external stability. More often, it's shaped by internal perspective. Consider how investors react during a market crash. Two people can own the exact same portfolio. One panics, sells everything at the worst possible moment, and locks in massive losses. The other understands long-term cycles, stays disciplined, and eventually benefits from the recovery. The market affected both investors equally, but their thinking produced completely different outcomes. Life works much the same way. Our interpretation of events often becomes more influential than the events themselves. That's why Scripture places such extraordinary emphasis on renewing the mind. Not because positive thinking magically solves every problem, but because distorted thinking quietly influences every decision we make. Fear changes how we speak. Pride changes how we listen. Shame changes how we see ourselves. Bitterness changes how we treat others. Before long, those thoughts become habits, and habits slowly become character. Imagine a sculptor standing before an enormous block of marble. Most people see a heavy stone with no obvious value. The sculptor sees something entirely different. Hidden within that stone is a masterpiece waiting to be revealed. Every careful strike removes what doesn't belong. The goal isn't to destroy the marble. The goal is to uncover what was always possible. Real transformation often feels exactly like that. At first, progress seems invisible. Day after day, nothing dramatic appears to happen. Yet over time, small changes accumulate. A little less fear, a little more patience, a little more confidence, a little less anger. Those quiet victories eventually produce a completely different person. One of the clearest examples appears in the story of Joshua. When Moses died, Israel lost the only leader an entire generation had ever known. Suddenly, the responsibility for leading millions of people rested on Joshua's shoulders. Ahead of him stood fortified cities, experienced armies, and challenges unlike anything he had faced before. From a human perspective, fear would have been the most reasonable response. Imagine accepting a promotion only to discover you're replacing one of the greatest leaders in your company's history. Every employee compares you to your predecessor. Every decision carries enormous consequences. Every mistake feels magnified. Most people would question whether they were truly qualified. Joshua faced something far greater. Yet instead of immediately removing every obstacle, God addressed Joshua's perspective first. Courage wasn't presented as a personality trait reserved for naturally confident people. It was presented as a choice rooted in trust rather than circumstances. That distinction changes everything. Confidence built on favorable circumstances disappears the moment life becomes difficult. Confidence built on God's promises remains steady because it isn't dependent on temporary conditions. Joshua still had battles ahead. He still had uncertainty. He still had moments when victory looked impossible. But before his feet ever stepped onto the battlefield, something much more important had to happen inside his mind. And that's where many people overlook the real miracle. They celebrate the walls that eventually fell, but forget the invisible battle that had already been won long before anyone heard the first trumpet. The same pattern continues today, although it often appears in much quieter ways. Every morning begins with countless influences competing for control of your attention. Headlines predict uncertainty. Advertisements convince you that you're incomplete without buying something new. Social media invites endless comparison. Old failures whisper that nothing will ever change. None of those voices need permission to enter your mind. But you do have a choice about which ones are allowed to stay. That choice, repeated day after day, becomes one of the most powerful forces shaping your future. Yet choosing the right voice is rarely as simple as it sounds. Even people with sincere faith can spend years believing ideas that quietly hold them back without ever realizing it. Sometimes the greatest obstacle isn't a lack of opportunity. It's an assumption we've accepted as truth. Peter's life illustrates this better than almost anyone else. When most people think about Peter, they remember the bold disciple who walked on water or the courageous leader who preached to thousands after the resurrection. But those victories came much later. Before Peter became a pillar of the early church, he repeatedly misunderstood what God was doing because he viewed everything through the lens of his own expectations. He believed strength meant avoiding weakness. He assumed the Messiah would establish an earthly kingdom through visible power. From Peter's perspective, suffering couldn't possibly fit into God's plan. Then Jesus revealed something Peter never expected. The problem wasn't Peter's passion. He loved Jesus deeply. The problem was that sincere passion, guided by incomplete understanding, can still lead us in the wrong direction. How often does that happen today? Someone prays for every obstacle to disappear when the obstacle is actually developing resilience. Another person assumes a closed door means rejection, when in reality it's protection. Someone interprets delay as abandonment, while God may be building the wisdom needed to handle what comes next. Perspective changes everything. Think about a child learning to ride a bicycle. The child may believe the parent's hand on the seat is preventing freedom. In reality, it's the very thing making growth possible. Only years later does the child understand that support was never the obstacle. It was the reason progress became possible. Life often works that way. We frequently ask God to remove every uncomfortable situation, while He uses those moments to shape qualities that comfort alone could never produce. Peter eventually discovered this through failure rather than success. Few experiences are more painful than believing you're stronger than you really are. Peter confidently declared that nothing could separate him from Jesus. His confidence sounded admirable, but it rested largely on his own determination. Only hours later, fear exposed the weakness he never knew existed. Imagine promising yourself you'll never repeat an old mistake. You genuinely mean it. Then pressure arrives, emotions rise, and suddenly you're making the exact decision you swore you'd never make again. The disappointment isn't just about failing, it's realizing how little you understood yourself. Peter experienced exactly that. Yet what happened afterward is perhaps the most encouraging part of his entire story. Jesus didn't define Peter by his worst moment. Instead of replacing him, He restored him. That single truth challenges one of the most common misconceptions people carry today. Many assume failure permanently disqualifies them. They believe one bad season determines the rest of their story. History repeatedly proves otherwise. Some of the world's most respected innovators failed spectacularly before succeeding. Investors have recovered from devastating losses. Athletes have returned stronger after career-threatening injuries. Businesses have reinvented themselves after near collapse. Growth rarely follows a straight line. The difference isn't the absence of failure. It's the willingness to learn from it. Peter stopped trusting his own confidence and began depending on something far more reliable. That shift didn't instantly change his personality. It changed the foundation beneath it. Once that foundation changed, courage naturally followed. The same principle appears far beyond Peter's story. Consider Saul, a man who believed he was completely right. From the outside, his life looked impressive. He possessed education, influence, discipline, and unwavering conviction. If anyone had asked whether he was serving God faithfully, Saul would have answered without hesitation. Yet conviction alone doesn't guarantee truth. History is filled with intelligent people who confidently defended ideas later proven wrong. Entire generations accepted beliefs that eventually collapsed under closer examination. Human certainty has always been imperfect. Saul's transformation began when he encountered evidence strong enough to challenge everything he thought he knew. Imagine spending decades building your identity around one worldview, only to discover its most important assumption was incomplete. Most people would resist that realization. Admitting we've been wrong can feel more painful than remaining comfortable. But genuine growth almost always begins where certainty ends. That's why humility is such a powerful quality. It allows us to exchange old assumptions for better understanding. After Saul's encounter with Christ, something remarkable happened. Instead of immediately returning to his previous routine, his life entered a period of stillness. At first glance, that pause seems insignificant. In reality, it was essential. Our culture celebrates constant movement. More information, more entertainment, more productivity, more opinions. We fill nearly every quiet moment with noise because silence often feels uncomfortable. Yet think about the moments when your biggest life decisions became clear. It while scrolling endlessly through your phone? Probably not. Was it during a hectic day filled with distractions? Unlikely. For many people, clarity arrives during quiet walks, long drives, moments of prayer, deep reflection, or conversations free from interruption. Stillness creates space for perspective. Picture a snow globe after it's been shaken. As long as the flakes keep swirling, the scene inside remains blurry. Only when everything settles does the image become clear. Our minds behave much the same way. Constant comparison. Endless headlines, financial worries, relationship stress, and unfinished responsibilities create mental noise that makes wise decisions harder to recognize. Learning to slow down isn't about escaping reality, it's about seeing reality more clearly. Paul eventually became one of Christianity's greatest teachers because his transformation didn't stop with one extraordinary encounter. It became a lifelong process of choosing better thoughts over destructive ones. That's a lesson many people overlook. That transformation isn't usually the result of one dramatic breakthrough. It's built through thousands of ordinary decisions. Every time you choose gratitude instead of resentment, you're strengthening a different mental pathway. Every time you replace panic with prayer instead of impulsive reactions, you're changing the direction of your thinking. Every time you refuse to let fear make your decisions, you're becoming a different person long before anyone else notices. Those changes seem almost invisible at first, but over months and years, they quietly reshape your character, your relationships, your confidence, and ultimately your entire life. And perhaps that's the greatest miracle of all. Not that every storm disappears, not that every prayer is answered exactly when we expect, but that the person walking through those storms becomes wiser, stronger, calmer, and more grounded than they ever imagined possible. Because when your thinking begins to change, your decisions begin to change. When your decisions change, your habits begin to change. When your habits change, your future changes with them. That's how lasting transformation has always worked. It begins quietly, one thought at a time.